us with a few minutes to kind of soak in, for me to ask you before the shook opens over there and everyone rushes the CDs, to hear from you. What's been evoked for you tonight? What impacted you? Questions. I want to hear, some of the things that has touched you tonight that maybe reinforced something you knew, maybe it was an aha, or just gave rise to a particular question. So, yeah, please. And if you could mind sharing your name.
Marcia Petrus.
Hey, Marcia.
Just when we were going through the sort of the tune of the weekdays and the evenings and the headlines, everybody could recognize the variations of the tune with the current. But how can that be when there's so much diversity? That it's so recognizable?
So the question is, how could we have recognized so many things when there's so many diversity and so many different streams and trends? Well, part of it is a quick demographic look. As I peer around the room, there's not such a huge range on the DNA level of the Jewish people in the room. We have a lot of different stories that were from different places, but we're not necessarily the most diverse in terms of backgrounds in that regard. So that may be it, but sometimes it's resonances of tradition, and sometimes it has to do with where we've been, a whole variety of things. And would you add, I noticed you were nodding as well. Do you have any other assessments in response to that?
There's certain things like that, like holiday new stuff that we just are nowhere near where we grew up. In this group, in this particular group, I agree completely. There's not much diversity here, and we're clinging still very strongly to that. We are not clinging strongly to the weekday stuff because we don't do a lot of weekday stuff. Sometimes when I do a should have been in and I use that weekday stuff, and I don't miss it. I know people are saying, why isn't she just going Ruth,
Right. So why isn't she using the Shabbat melody? Because
but they don't know
the text.
That's the melody, what she's doing.
So that's a switch. In other words, the weekday melody that we just lighted on was the most familiar to our people up until modernity, because it's the one you would have done the most. So it's a new age. And I like the way you said clinging to that. Right? So there's something about that, especially for those of us that might be once or twice a year coming in to sing that soundtrack of the Jewish people, that has a whole resonance, not just about high holy days, but Jewish identity. And that's why often, especially when I talk to younger musicians or clergy, when they're going into communities with their 20 new tunes, I say, save it. Learn what they're doing first, right? And then maybe introduce one new, you are changed by your very essence and their fear of what might happen. Wait a little while, introduce one new melody, maybe a couple before the end of the year, because the culture changed, people's identity is connected to that soundtrack. And we know that from Mark, oh, I remember that song, oh my God, that was my first kiss, that was my this, that was my whatever else, let's play the song, favorite song at the wedding. We do that all the time with music that isn't what we would say Jewish music. So how much more so in this particular case? Any other things that you've taken out of tonight or questions you have or comments? Yes, and let me, go ahead. Well, you can get out between the two of you.
I had a question about this trope, because when exactly did we start using trope? When do those little things get put onto the Torah? They just start, was it always like that? When did we get the Torah? Was this little...
Okay, let me jump in with you there, because I want to make sure we have a broad literacy here, so make sure before we use too many insider trading terms. Trope itself, right? Trope, which is like Nusach is the carrier wave for prayer. Trope is the carrier wave for reading the Torah. And that melody line, right, which is very ancient, itself, which actually most of us know. If you can, even hum along if you don't know the words. So the way I approach trope is I invite people to sing that and I say, 70%, let's learn the other 30%. As opposed to some mysterious thing that's so far across the sea. So that carrier wave, you can hear it comes from a different culture. It shifts in the high holy days. Suddenly, if I'm listening to Torah, the same passage is sung differently at a different time of year. It tells me something else is going on. The 5 scrolls have different melody lines, and so on. So that's a more extensive lesson, but like the carrier wave of that, it's both ancient, but it's picked up at different times, and it was a way of attaching meaning. So we sing meaning, like it's punctuation, right? Like the little signs or symbols, if you ever look on it in a chumash, are the notes, but they're also the meaning, right? I came here this evening, and I picked up my guitar, brought it in the auditorium, so I could play it throughout the night. And so if I was writing, you know, that people have written stuff to Obama speeches, you know, trope to this and the other thing, you know, a friend of mine, Hassan, wrote it to one of Lincoln's speeches, and if you do that exercise, you start to realize what our ancestors were doing. They were giving you, the reader, the cues, the syntax, like an original manuscript of a Shakespeare play. My background's in acting. Having gotten a chance to work with original manuscripts, the number of words on the line was the direction to the actor on what level of intensity of emotion and character stance to take. So if I had 6 words on the line versus 13, that was the inherent direction as to how I was supposed to deliver a line and what feeling state I was to have. So that's built into the soundtrack as well on those levels.
So what I'm asking really
I thought I'd answer that. I want to move on to another question.
But I mean, how far back? He said ancient. It looks like ancient's quite a lot of different.
You know what? Let's, just for the sake of time, there is no real answer to that. I could not with integrity give you, you know, 73 AD at Bob's Cottage. Because
you could tell when it was codified, when it was written down. It was like, you know Homer, right? People were
I don't really know personally. But,
I don't mean Homer Simpson.
I know.
That was sung, and the reason it was sung in Greek was because a lot of people couldn't read, and singing it helped memorize. So just assume, vaguely, because all we have are shadows and echoes, just assume that people were familiar with the melody and it helped them memorize maybe certain passages of the Torah. There were people, of course, who knew the whole Torah. In the 9th century, a family in Tiberias wrote down those little marks, and then it was codified, and now we still use that.
Is there thinking that actually came from the desert period?
we don't know. I want to move on for subject matter, but those things, but don't get caught up in that. Because ultimately, you're not going to get the date, and for our people's sake, that's not our issue, right? So just like we have we're about to read Bereshit. Have you know there's 2 different creation stories that we're going to chant a week from now? We weren't hung up on that. We were, before there was polarity management, there was the Jewish people. I can have this tradition that says the world was created this way and this thing. I can have evolutionary theory and creationism standing in one classroom, and Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim. These are both things. So if I have the date, if I know it's from Turkey or whatever, the thing is, does it still resonate? That's what we're looking for. But great questions, please.
I do have an erudite question.
An erudite, is that a place near Armenia or something? What do you think?
I do have a little bit of feedback in our Reconstructionist community here. It really was only got 15 years old. So many of these new melodies or old times are so incorporated in our daily use that we're just comfortable as we sing.
So the old, and I'm noticing that this evening, how Shlomo, who was once in a certain Lubavitch field, is now, you know, everybody's, and even beyond Orthodoxy, etc., has become, well, salam, so we're singing Israeli melody, we're eating these words. I consciously chose them to make the point that when we talk about traditional music, or what is the right music, or the right way, we're often talking about familiarity and culture and location. Not necessarily. I sang you some very traditional things tonight, and people were like, what the heck is that? That's the most traditional thing you could get here, the weekday Nusach, and that was the thing that people were most out to lunch for. Okay? I feel Brian's closing presence and his comfort in this way, so I'll defer back over to him.